It began as a whisper inside the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace and Archivist, requesting access to a sealed Windsor-era correspondence file marked Private Royal Directive. Within hours, senior aides grew tense. Princess Anne's name surfaced unexpectedly, followed by Queen Elizabeth II's final authority stamp. And at the center of it all, Camilla's contested royal title. What was first dismissed as old paperwork is now being described as a document that could reshape the monarchy's internal balance. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The request itself was unremarkable at first glance: routine archival verification, the kind that passes through Windsor's administrative channels without disruption. But something about the file designation changed everything. The moment the classification code was cross-checked, the atmosphere shifted. Doors that usually remained open to historians were quietly sealed. Internal systems flagged the entry with an old, rarely used protocol reserved for materials tied directly to Queen Elizabeth II's personal authority. In those corridors where silence is standard procedure, even silence began to feel heavier than usual. Within hours, whispers moved faster than official memos. Senior aides, normally detached from archival affairs, were seen reviewing logs that should not have required their attention. Princess Anne's name surfaced not as speculation, but as a historical anchor point, someone who, years earlier, had insisted on rigid documentation standards during the late Queen's administrative years. It was this insistence, according to quiet institutional memory, that may have preserved the very trail leading back to the sealed letter, and as that realization settled in, attention shifted sharply toward the most sensitive thread in the file. Camilla's formal royal styling, a subject long assumed to be settled, now suddenly reopened by paper that was never meant to resurface. By late evening, the tone inside the palace had changed entirely. What had begun as an archival inquiry was now being treated as a matter of internal constitutional sensitivity. Aides were instructed, without formal announcement, to limit discussion even among trusted departments. The usual flow of information fractured into isolated conversations behind closed doors. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, fragments of speculation began to leak. Carefully phrased but unmistakably urgent. References to suppressed royal instructions began appearing in whispered commentary. Among media insiders who had spent years studying the subtle tensions of the House of Windsor. And yet, beneath all the controlled silence, one detail refused to fade. The archivist was not simply reviewing history, he was tracing something that appeared deliberately preserved, deliberately hidden, and still legally intact under layers of royal administrative protection. The deeper he went, the more it seemed that this was not a forgotten document at all, but a decision waiting for its moment to be understood. A decision that connected legacy, authority, and the unresolved question of titles that shaped the modern monarchy in ways few were prepared to confront. But the true shock was not the existence of the letter, it was what the archivist claimed it explicitly contained. In the depths of a restricted Windsor archive, a senior royal archivist reportedly uncovered a misfiled red-sealed envelope labeled under Queen Elizabeth II's final administrative directives. According to internal whispers, the contents referenced title governance protocols and included names that were never meant to resurface in public discourse. The discovery immediately triggered a silent escalation through palace administration channels. The vault itself was not a place of casual access. Every entry was logged, every movement recorded, every pause between. Files treated as potential risk. That night, however, something unusual appeared in the system trace. An access window opened far later than protocol normally allowed. No celebration, no public event, no official duty explained it. Just a quiet administrative breach that, on paper, looked harmless. But within Windsor's rigid memory of procedure, even the smallest irregularity carried weight. And this one carried the unmistakable signature of urgency. The red seal changed everything. In royal administrative culture, color was not decoration, it was hierarchy. Red meant authority at its highest tier, the kind reserved for sovereign directives that bypassed ordinary governance channels. When the archivist first laid eyes on the envelope, It was reportedly misfiled among routine succession-adjacent documentation, almost hidden in plain sight. Yet its classification header told a different story entirely. References tied to title governance, a phrase rarely seen outside the most sensitive constitutional frameworks of the monarchy. As the document was carefully extracted, the atmosphere inside the archival chamber shifted from routine silence to controlled tension. The archivist, trained to remain detached, reportedly paused longer than expected before proceeding. Because the language embedded within such documents is never casual, it is deliberate, precise, and often binding in ways that extend far beyond immediate administration. And here, according to internal interpretations, the phrasing hinted at mechanisms that governed royal styling, legitimacy structures, and the formal recognition of titles that define public identity within the crown. It was this specific detail that triggered the first escalation. Not public alarm, not external exposure, but internal procedural alert. The discovery was immediately flagged upward through constitutional advisory channels, bypassing standard archival reporting lines. Senior advisors, normally insulated from day-to-day document handling, were quietly brought into the loop. And with them came the first wave of concern. If this document was authentic, then it was not simply historical. It was active within the legal memory of the institution. Within hours, the language inside the palace changed. Words like review, verification, and classification integrity began replacing the more neutral terms of archival work. The concern was no longer about what the document contained, but about what its existence implied. If Queen Elizabeth II had issued such a directive, and if it had remained unprocessed or partially obscured within archival systems, then the implications stretched into the very structure of how royal titles had been understood in the modern era. And yet, even as advisors worked through the procedural shock, a deeper unease began to surface. Because this was not just about one sealed envelope. It suggested continuity, something drafted with intention, preserved with caution, and left unresolved within the monarchy's institutional memory. A decision not forgotten, but contained, waiting. However, what the archivist had found was only the surface of a much older and more deliberate royal decision. Insiders now suggest the sealed letter bore Queen Elizabeth II's unmistakable cipher. An official directive never circulated through public or parliamentary channels. Within its restrained but precise language, references allegedly appear to the regulation of royal titles, tied to marriage and legitimacy within the institution. Most strikingly, it is believed the letter contained language that placed strict limitations on Camilla's formal styling under certain constitutional conditions. The cipher itself is what immediately elevated the document beyond ordinary archival material. In royal administrative practice, a cipher is not just a signature, it is an assertion of sovereign authority, a mark that transforms paper into constitutional weight. When that symbol appears on a red box directive, it signals something deeply deliberate, something never intended for casual interpretation or retrospective discovery. And according to internal interpretations now circulating quietly through advisory circles, this was not a draft, not a suggestion, but a structured instruction tied to the most sensitive layer of royal identity: titles and legitimacy. The classification attached to the letter only deepens the tension surrounding it. Marked as a sealed directive. Not for public release, it was reportedly handled through a restricted procedural channel used only for the Queen's most private constitutional considerations. These were the kinds of documents that rarely entered general archival systems unless deliberately preserved for institutional memory. And yet, here it was present, intact, and apparently untouched by any formal execution during the late Queen's lifetime. That absence alone raises a question that now echoes through palace corridors with growing weight. Why preserve authority without activating it? Within the alleged content, the focus on title governance has become the most discussed element among those aware of its existence. Royal titles are not symbolic decorations, they define public legitimacy, constitutional positioning, and the visible hierarchy of the monarchy itself. Any suggestion that such titles were subject to conditional frameworks immediately introduces complexity into what the public assumes to be settled. History. And here, insiders suggest, the language did not simply describe recognition, it reportedly outlined conditions under which styling could be limited or adjusted in response to institutional circumstances. It is this conditional framing that has drawn the most intense scrutiny. Because if interpreted as described, it would imply that even the most senior figures within the modern royal structure operate under legacy frameworks that extend beyond current public understanding. Nothing was ever formally activated, nothing publicly enforced. Yet the existence of such wording inside a sovereign directive suggests a parallel layer of constitutional intention, one that existed on paper but remained dormant in practice. That gap between written authority and real-world execution is where the mystery now deepens. And yet, even more unsettling than the content itself is the silence surrounding it. No official acknowledgement, no historical clarification, no public explanation of why such a directive was stored without apparent activation. In the rigid architecture of royal documentation, silence is never neutral, it is procedural. It often means containment, delay, or deliberate preservation for future interpretation. And that possibility transforms the letter from a forgotten artifact into something far more consequential. A decision suspended in time, waiting for the moment it would resurface. But as the archival investigation continues to widen, attention begins to shift away from the document itself and toward the question of awareness. Because within palace circles, there are growing suggestions that this was never truly hidden, only quietly known by those positioned closest to the center of royal continuity. And yet, the most explosive revelation was not what the Queen wrote but who allegedly knew about it all along. The archival interpretation reportedly triggered immediate constitutional concern because it appeared to contradict the public evolution of Camilla's royal styling. While officially recognized as Queen Consort, the sealed directive allegedly suggests a far more conditional framework. This has reopened old debates inside palace circles about whether certain titles were ever fully settled or quietly managed behind closed doors. The shock was not in the existence of Camilla's public recognition, but in the possibility that beneath it lay an older, more restrained structure of intent, one that had never been publicly reconciled with modern ceremony. Within royal administration, titles are expected to move in a linear progression: acknowledgement, confirmation, and institutional acceptance. But this alleged archival material introduces something far more complex, a suggestion that recognition and restriction may have existed simultaneously, layered one over the other without ever being openly resolved. And that contradiction is what now unsettles those who study the monarchy's internal continuity. For decades, Camilla's role has been carefully positioned within the evolving identity of the institution, framed through ceremony, duty, and gradual public acceptance. Yet insiders now suggest that the sealed directive reintroduces a forgotten tension. The question of whether that acceptance was ever absolute or whether it was shaped by conditions never formally disclosed. That uncertainty has reignited discussions among constitutional advisors who are now being asked to revisit not just what was announced publicly, but what may have been preserved privately in the late Queen's administrative archives. What makes this moment even more sensitive is the growing divide between historical record and interpretive authority. On one side stands the public-facing narrative, clear, formal, and widely accepted. On the other lies a potential documentary layer that suggests nuance, limitation, and procedural caution. Advisors reviewing precedent are now reportedly confronting a difficult question. When a sovereign directive remains sealed and unexecuted, does it retain constitutional influence, or does time render it symbolic? There is no simple answer, only competing interpretations shaped by institutional caution and legal tradition. Inside palace discussions, disagreement has begun to surface quietly. Some argue that without formal activation, any such directive holds no practical authority and exists only as archival history. Others, however, suggest that the mere existence of Queen Elizabeth II's ciphered instruction cannot be dismissed so easily, especially when it concerns the delicate architecture of royal titles. This tension has created an atmosphere where even historical certainty feels unexpectedly fragile, as if long-settled conclusions are being carefully re-examined under new light. The sensitivity is compounded by the fact that coronation-era decisions surrounding royal styling were widely assumed to be final. Public statements, ceremonial recognition, and institutional acceptance all reinforced a sense of closure. Yet the emergence of this document challenges that perception, suggesting that closure may have been procedural rather than absolute. And in a monarchy built on continuity, even the suggestion of unresolved layers beneath established tradition carries profound weight. As these interpretations circulate through advisory channels, the atmosphere shifts from curiosity to caution. Every reference to precedent, every mention of title governance, now carries renewed significance. What once appeared settled history is being revisited as a living framework, one that may still contain echoes of decisions never fully brought into the public narrative. But within the palace, one figure was now being unexpectedly linked to the original containment of this secret Princess Anne. As the archival chain of custody was reconstructed, Princess Anne's name surfaced not as a participant in controversy, but as someone who had reportedly insisted on preserving strict constitutional documentation standards decades earlier. According to internal interpretations, Anne may have safeguarded or insisted upon the formal recording of Queen Elizabeth II's directive, long before anyone considered its future implications. The revelation did not arrive as a sudden defense of her character, but as a slow and unavoidable recalibration of her role within the institution's memory. For years, Princess Anne had been publicly understood as the monarchy's most disciplined, constant presence, unshaken, almost procedural in her devotion to duty. Yet within the deeper administrative layers of the palace, that same discipline now takes on a different meaning. It was not just consistency, it was control. A meticulous insistence that every directive, every instruction, every sovereign nuance be recorded with precision, regardless of how politically sensitive it might become later. That reputation, long acknowledged but rarely examined, is now being reframed inside advisory circles as something far more significant than routine diligence. She was not simply a working royal fulfilling obligation, she was, according to internal recollections, the quiet enforcer of archival integrity, the one who ensured that even uncomfortable decisions were not lost to informal handling or diplomatic softening. And in a system where omission can be as powerful as record, that insistence may have preserved exactly the kind of document now at the center of escalating concern. Insiders describe her as constitutionally uncompromising, a phrase that carries weight in an environment built on balance between tradition and adaptation. Because in royal governance, flexibility often defines survival, but rigidity defines permanence. Anne's approach, as it is now being revisited, appears to have leaned firmly toward permanence. If something was issued by the late Queen, it was to be documented fully, without dilution, without reinterpretation, without administrative smoothing. And it is precisely that philosophy that may have ensured the survival of the sealed directive now under scrutiny. What makes this shift so powerful is not just the content of the archival discovery, but the reversal of perception it forces upon those reviewing it. A figure once seen as peripheral in the emotional narratives of royal controversy is now being repositioned as central to its structural foundation. Not because she altered outcomes, but because she preserved the framework in which those outcomes would one day be judged. In that sense, Anne is no longer being viewed through the lens of speculation or suspicion, but through something far more complex: institutional necessity. This reframing does not erase tension. Instead, it deepens it. Because if Anne did indeed ensure the preservation of Queen Elizabeth II's directive, then the document was never hidden by accident. It was preserved by design. And design, in royal constitutional terms, implies intention that extends beyond immediate consequence. It suggests foresight. It suggests that what appears dormant today may have always been meant to resurface under conditions not yet understood. As this interpretation gains quiet traction, the atmosphere inside palace advisory circles shifts once again. What was once a question of authenticity becomes a question of responsibility. Not who discovered the letter, but who ensured it could not be erased. And in that distinction lies the growing weight of Anne's renewed position within the narrative. not as an accidental witness to history, but as one of its most deliberate guardians. Yet vindication of Anne only intensified pressure on the palace to respond to what the Archivist had officially uncovered. Following the Archivist's confirmation, palace administrative systems reportedly entered rapid containment mode. Access logs were restricted, document classification tiers were reviewed, and internal advisory teams were activated under strict confidentiality protocols. The existence of a sealed Queen Elizabeth II directive concerning royal titles became a matter of constitutional sensitivity rather than historical curiosity. What unfolded next was not chaos in the visible sense, but something far more controlled and unsettling, an institutional tightening so precise it felt almost invisible from the outside. Within the archival network, permissions that once allowed measured scholarly access were abruptly narrowed. What had been a structured but open system of historical preservation transformed overnight into a fortified digital and procedural barrier. Even internal staff, accustomed to navigating Windsor's layered documentation architecture, are familiar with the complexities of its internal structure, found themselves halted at levels they previously crossed without friction. The trigger for this shift was not uncertainty about the document's existence, but fear of its implications. Once a directive is confirmed to carry Queen Elizabeth II's cipher, it ceases to be treated as passive history. It becomes potential authority, something that might still hold interpretive weight within constitutional frameworks. And that possibility alone was enough to activate protocols rarely used outside moments of institutional crisis. Advisors were no longer simply reviewing content, they were evaluating risk, precedent, and the fragile boundary between recorded intent and modern governance. Inside these closed advisory circles, discussions reportedly grew more cautious with every passing hour. Words were chosen carefully, almost defensively, as if language itself could trigger unintended consequences. Some argued that archival classification must remain strictly historical, insulated from reinterpretation. Others, however, raised a more uncomfortable question. If a sovereign directive was never formally revoked, does its presence in the archive represent closure or continuation in suspended form? That question alone fractured the ease of consensus that usually governs royal administrative interpretation. Meanwhile, communication across palace departments began to tighten. What was once a layered but fluid exchange of information became segmented into isolated channels. Staff were instructed, directly or indirectly, to avoid referencing specific details outside approved advisory loops. Even the tone of internal correspondence shifted, less explanatory, more procedural, stripped of anything that could be externally reconstructed. It was not silence, but controlled compression of language designed to prevent narrative drift beyond institutional boundaries. At the same time, efforts to stabilize external perception began forming quietly in parallel. While no official statements were made, insiders describe a coordinated attempt to ensure that speculation remained contained within interpretive limits. The goal was not to deny the existence of the archival discovery, but to prevent its meaning from expanding beyond control. In a monarchy built as much on perception as procedure, narrative stability is not secondary, it is structural necessity. Yet even as containment measures intensified, they exposed a deeper tension within the system itself. Because every restriction, every classification review, every advisory meeting pointed back to the same unresolved core. A document that should have remained dormant, but now refused to stay buried in procedural obscurity. And with each attempt to stabilize its status, its significance only grew heavier. Classification. Disputes soon emerged over how the directive should even be defined. Was it a historical artifact preserved but inactive? Or a constitutional echo with potential interpretive relevance? The difference was not semantic, it was structural. It determined whether the document belonged to the past or still cast a shadow over the present framework of royal authority. And that uncertainty ensured the debate could not simply be closed. As the pressure built within advisory channels, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. Containment could manage access. It could regulate communication. It could slow interpretation. But it could not erase the fact that something long assumed to be settled had re-entered the institutional present with undeniable force. But even containment could not prevent the inevitable escalation toward the very top of the monarchy. King Charles III now finds himself positioned at the center of a delicate institutional dilemma, with the Archivist's confirmation circulating through senior advisory circles. He is reportedly required to evaluate whether Queen Elizabeth II's sealed directive holds a binding constitutional weight, or whether the modern royal framework has already superseded it. The decision, insiders suggest, carries symbolic consequences far beyond administrative procedure. The pressure surrounding this moment does not arrive as a single force, but as a layered convergence of responsibility, legacy, and institutional memory. Within the inner architecture of royal decision-making, Charles is not simply a monarch responding to an archival discovery. He is the living bridge between two constitutional eras. On one side stands the enduring framework shaped by Queen Elizabeth II's long reign, built on continuity, discipline, and carefully preserved authority. On the other stands a modern monarchy that must operate in real time, adapting to public expectation, legal interpretation, and evolving institutional clarity. What makes this dilemma so intense is not just the existence of the sealed directive, but the question it forces into the present. Does historical authority retain power if it was never formally enacted, or does time quietly neutralize it without declaration? Advisors reportedly frame this not as a simple legal query, but as a constitutional stress test, one that challenges the monarchy's understanding of its own continuity. Every interpretation carries consequence, because every conclusion sets precedent for how future undisclosed directives may be treated. Inside private consultations, the tone is described as measured but heavy. Senior constitutional advisors, along with select members of the royal inner circle, are said to be weighing not only the content of the document, but the implications of acknowledging it at all. To validate it as binding would open the door to historical directives shaping present identity. To dismiss it entirely would risk appearing to override the late Queen's sovereign authority. Either path carries institutional weight that cannot be easily reversed. The most difficult tension lies in balance between stability and legitimacy. The monarchy has always depended on the perception that its evolution is both continuous and controlled. But this situation introduces an unpredictable variable, a documented instruction from the past that was never publicly resolved. If activated, it could reshape understanding of royal title governance. If ignored, it could raise questions about archival transparency and historical continuity. In both cases, the institution is forced to confront not just what the directive says, but what it represents. Within these discussions, emotional pressure is said to intersect with constitutional responsibility in an unusually direct way. Charles is not only interpreting a document, he is navigating the legacy of a mother whose authority defined an era. That emotional dimension, though rarely acknowledged publicly, adds a layer of complexity that cannot be separated from institutional reasoning. Every potential outcome carries symbolic resonance, not just procedural consequence. Meanwhile, concern over precedent grows steadily. Advisors recognize that whatever decision is reached will not exist in isolation. It will become a reference point for how the monarchy treats sealed instructions, historical directives, and archival discoveries moving forward. That awareness introduces caution into every sentence, every interpretation, every proposed conclusion. Nothing is neutral anymore, everything is precedent in formation. As the weight of this responsibility deepens, the monarchy begins to feel the quiet pressure of transformation, not through declaration, but through deliberation itself. The act of deciding has become as significant as the outcome it will produce, because it signals how the institution defines authority across time. And as deliberations intensify, the monarchy edges toward a redefinition of its internal order. What emerges from the unfolding archival revelation is not merely a debate over one title, but a broader reaffirmation of how the monarchy defines authority, legacy, and internal discipline. Whether Queen Elizabeth II's sealed letter is ultimately interpreted as binding or symbolic, its existence alone has already reshaped conversations at the highest level of royal governance. What follows is not disruption in the public sense, but a quieter and more profound recalibration. Within the institution itself. The monarchy, long defined by its ability to project continuity, now finds itself reflecting on the very mechanisms that create that continuity. Because authority inside the royal framework has never been a single fixed point, it is a layered structure built across generations, reinforced by precedent, refined through interpretation, and protected through disciplined restraint. And when a sealed directive from a previous sovereign re-enters that system, even as a historical artifact, it forces a reconsideration of how past intent interacts with present structure. Within this recalibration, archival governance becomes unexpectedly central. What once appeared to be a purely administrative function, organizing, preserving, cataloging, now carries constitutional sensitivity. Every document tied to sovereign authority is no longer just a record of history, but a potential reference point in ongoing institutional identity. This shift has led to a renewed emphasis on structured interpretation, where historical materials are no longer viewed in isolation, but within a broader constitutional continuum that demands careful, almost cautious reading. It is within this atmosphere that Princess Anne's name continues to surface with renewed significance. Her role, once understood primarily through the lens of duty and consistency, is now being reframed as something more foundational. She represents continuity not through symbolism, but through procedural discipline, the insistence that institutional memory must remain intact, even when it becomes uncomfortable. In this light, she is no longer seen as peripheral to archival matters, but as one of the quiet stabilizing forces that ensured the monarchy's documentary integrity remained uncompromised across decades of change. At the same time, Camilla's position exists within a more delicate symbolic frame. Not destabilized, not challenged in formal terms, but inevitably shaped by the renewed attention surrounding historical interpretations of royal titles. Within institutional circles, the emphasis is not on reversal or correction, but on sensitivity, on ensuring that modern recognition remains steady even as historical documents are re-examined. It becomes a matter of balance, where perception and procedure must align carefully to avoid unnecessary rupture in public understanding. And yet, despite all internal reassessment, one principle remains firmly intact. The monarchy adapts, without public fracture. Its strength lies not in the absence of tension, but in its ability to absorb it, contain it, and transform it into procedural clarity over time. Behind closed doors, interpretation may shift, discussions may intensify, and frameworks may be refined, but outwardly, continuity remains unbroken, preserving the image of stability that defines the institution. But beneath the silence of palace stone and sealed archives, one truth remains: legacy is never truly written in the past. It continues to be negotiated in the present. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.